There is a particular kind of political stupidity that disguises itself as toughness, the kind that swings a sledgehammer at the foundation of one's own house in order to frighten away the neighbors. Conservatives, who are now calling for a ban on Muslim public prayer in the United States, are engaging in exactly this kind of self-defeating bravado. The impulse is understandable. The cultural anxieties are real. The concern about Islamist ideology in Western nations is well documented and entirely legitimate. But the remedy being prescribed would kill the patient along with the disease. If we allow government the power to ban Muslim prayer in public, we have handed that same government the power to ban Christian prayer in public. And given the trajectory of this culture, we should have no illusions about which direction that axe eventually swings. The argument for banning Muslim public prayer has a surface-level logic that appeals to those who are watching, with growing alarm, the deliberate Islamization of the public square. They are not wrong to be alarmed, but they are wrong about the solution. Let us not pretend there is nothing worth discussing here. The practice of public street prayer by Muslim groups in Western cities is not, as its apologists insist, an innocent and purely spiritual exercise. Islamic scholars and even prominent religious figures within Muslim communities have acknowledged that Muslims in Muslim-majority nations are not generally obligated to pray immediately and on the street, and that observant Muslims in those countries typically wait until they are home or at a mosque to pray. The 5 times daily street prayer that has become a flashpoint in European and American cities, blocking traffic and public thoroughfares, is not an ancient religious necessity transplanted wholesale to the West. It is, in many cases, something different. Observers on both sides of the debate have noted that street prayer in Western cities carries a quality of deliberate public witness, what one analyst described as a well-studied act of religious propaganda, a demonstration to the unbelieving West that Islam has arrived and intends to be seen. Even prominent Muslim scholars have advised worshippers to avoid praying on roads and in places where people walk and gather, and the practice of street prayer has been described as a divisive issue even among Muslims. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is the acknowledgement that blocking public sidewalks and streets with religious observance 5 times daily is a political act as much as a spiritual one, and it should be treated accordingly through existing public nuisance and noise ordinance law, which is already well equipped to handle it. The amplified call to prayer presents a similar and more legally tractable problem. Cities and nations across the Western world, from Germany and France to the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, have moved not to ban the call to prayer outright, but to regulate its volume, timing, and broadcast, treating it as they would any other amplified noise in a residential neighborhood. This is the correct response. A mosque broadcasting the Adhan at 3 a.m. at concert-level decibels is a public nuisance problem, not a theological one. And noise ordinances that apply equally to church bells and mosque loudspeakers are both constitutional and enforceable. But banning Muslim prayer itself? That is an entirely different category of action, and those calling for it should be pressed to explain, clearly and without evasion, what they are actually proposing. The First Amendment to the Constitution reads plainly, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Supreme Court has consistently held that the Free Exercise Clause forbids Congress from prohibiting the free exercise of religion, and that this protection applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. The Free Exercise Clause protects citizens' right to practice their religion as they please, so long as the practice does not run afoul of a compelling governmental interest related to public morals or safety. This protection is not conditional on whether we like the religion in question. It is not a courtesy extended to faiths that have earned our approval. The founders did not write a free exercise clause for comfortable popular religions. They wrote it because they had lived under regimes that wielded government power against minority religious expression, and they wanted no part of that inheritance on American soil. Many early settlers made the dangerous journey from Europe to the New World specifically to escape religious persecution, and the protections built into the First Amendment were drawn directly from that experience. Now comes the critical question that the banned Muslim prayer crowd never seems to want to answer. If we grant government the authority to prohibit the public religious exercise of one faith, on what constitutional or logical principle do we prevent that authority from being applied to another? The principle being established is not ban Islam. The principle being established is government may ban public religious exercise. And that principle does not expire when the political winds shift. It waits. Those who believe that conservative Christian governance will be permanent in America, and is therefore the only political force that would ever wield such a ban, have a dangerously short memory. Courts change, majorities shift, administrations turn over. The legal infrastructure you build to suppress Muslim prayer today is the legal infrastructure a different administration uses to regulate, restrict, and ultimately suppress Christian prayer tomorrow. A government powerful enough to ban one religion's public worship is powerful enough to ban yours. This is not hypothetical concern trolling. The Supreme Court has already held that government-sponsored prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. Progressive activists have repeatedly attempted to use noise ordinances, public assembly regulations, and hate speech frameworks to curtail Christian witness in the public square. Street preachers have been arrested. Christian groups have been denied permits. Churches have been sued. The machinery of suppression is already being assembled against Christians, and some conservatives now want to hand that machinery a constitutional precedent. Here is where clarity of thought becomes essential, because the muddling of two very distinct concepts is precisely what is driving this bad policy impulse. There is a legitimate and necessary argument to be made that Sharia law, the legal and political governance system derived from Islamic jurisprudence, is incompatible with the American constitutional order and should have no standing in American courts. Mainstream Muslim American scholars have themselves acknowledged that Sharia's criminal law components can only properly be applied in Muslim-majority countries with Sharia courts. Legislative efforts to ensure that American courts apply American law, not foreign religious legal systems, are entirely defensible on constitutional grounds. But Sharia law and Muslim prayer are not the same thing, not even close. One is a system of governance that competes with and seeks to supplant constitutional law. The other is a religious practice protected by constitutional law. Conflating them is either intellectual laziness or deliberate misdirection, and either way, it leads to policy catastrophe. We can and should be absolutely clear that no American court will enforce Sharia-derived judgments. We can and should resist the cultural and political pressure to accommodate Sharia frameworks in our institutions. None of that requires touching the free exercise clause. None of it requires banning prayer. Conservatives who are genuinely grappling with the cultural implications of Islam's growing visibility in America are not wrong to note something unusual about the phenomenon of street prayer in the West. The practice cannot be justified as a strict religious obligation. Islamic jurisprudence explicitly permits the combining of prayers when circumstances require it, meaning that blocking a public street at noon is not, in fact, religiously necessary. The display is, at least in part, a statement of presence and permanence, a cultural and political signal dressed in religious garb. Understanding it as such clarifies both the problem and the response. If street prayer is in part a claim on public space, a demonstration that Islam has arrived in the West and intends to shape the culture, then the answer is not to suppress it through government prohibition, which would both fail constitutionally and invite persecution of all public religious expression. The answer is to respond in kind, but better. Christians in America have largely retreated from the public square, content to confine their faith to Sunday mornings and private conscience. This retreat has been culturally catastrophic. The public space vacated by a privatized Christianity does not remain neutral. It is occupied by something else. We are watching that occupation happen in real time. The Apostle Paul did not pray quietly in a corner so as not to offend the Athenians. He stood in the Areopagus. The early church did not hide its worship behind closed doors when the culture around it was hostile. It went out into the streets and the marketplaces and the synagogues and proclaimed what it believed to be true. Scripture itself commands the public expression of faith. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Matthew 5:16. The answer to Islam's public assertiveness is not government suppression. It is Christian boldness. If Muslims gathering in Washington Square Park for public prayer represents a claim on the culture, the Christian response is not to call the government to stop them. It is to gather in greater numbers, in greater faith, in even greater public witness, not to confront or harass, but to demonstrate by example what a people shaped by the gospel of Jesus Christ actually looks like. The public square will not be won by whoever successfully weaponizes the government against the other. It will be won by whoever occupies it most faithfully and most visibly over time. Europe offers a cautionary tale that runs in both directions, and American conservatives should pay careful attention to both halves of it. On one side, Europe's near-total abdication of its Christian cultural heritage, enforced by a secular establishment deeply hostile to public religious expression, created a vacuum that is now being filled by a resurgent Islam emboldened precisely by the weakness of the culture it is entering. On the other side, France's 2011 ban on street prayer, enacted after far-right pressure, did not slow the cultural momentum of Islam in France. It simply drove the practice indoors and handed Islamist organizers a persecution narrative that proved extraordinarily effective for recruitment and solidarity. France banned prayers on the streets of Paris in 2011, but this legislative victory for critics of street prayer produced no lasting cultural result, and instead inflamed the very dynamic it sought to resolve. A government prohibition on religious practice, when applied to a community that already perceives itself as under siege, does not produce assimilation. It produces entrenchment. It strengthens the identity politics of victimhood that Islamist organizers depend upon to maintain community cohesion and resist integration. Americans who want to slow the spread of Islamist influence in their communities would do far better to understand what actually makes Islam's public presence in the West politically potent, and what genuinely weakens it, rather than reaching reflexively for government bans that fail on contact with constitutional reality. The conservative response to the challenge of Islam's growing cultural assertiveness in America should be threefold. First, enforce the laws that already exist. Public nuisance statutes, noise ordinances, public assembly regulations, and traffic laws apply to everyone equally. A religious group blocking a public street or broadcasting amplified sound at prohibited hours is subject to existing law, and that law should be applied without fear. No new legislation targeting religious practice is needed, only the will to enforce what already exists without making special exemptions based on religious identity. Second, draw the Sharia line clearly and hold it. American courts apply American law. That is not negotiable, and legislation making it explicit is entirely appropriate. The legal, political, and governance dimensions of Islamist ideology are proper subjects of legislative action. The prayer mat is not. Third, and most urgently, Christians must reclaim the public square, not through harassment of those with whom they disagree, not through the theater of disruption, but through the quiet, consistent, and unashamed public witness of lives and communities shaped by the gospel. Group prayer in public parks, visible charity, engagement in civic life that does not hide its animating faith. The Church in America has enormous cultural resources it has largely chosen not to deploy. The moment calls for their deployment. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. The promise of that verse is not made to governments that ban the right religions. It is made to a people who pray. The solution to a culture being claimed by another faith is not the suppression of prayer. It is the intensification of our own. The First Amendment that protects Muslim prayer in public is the same First Amendment that has protected Christian prayer in public for 230 years. Tear it down for one, and you have torn it down for both. The wiser course, the braver course, is to fill the public square with the thing we actually believe, and trust that the truth, stated plainly and lived faithfully, is more than sufficient to hold its ground.
Stay out of my territory.